The letter arrived on the same morning they buried her father. Evelyn St. Remy stood at the window while men she did not recognize carried boxes from the house, and she understood, with the particular clarity that comes only after catastrophe has finished its work, that grief was not the worst thing a person could inherit. The worst thing was what came after grief. The accounting. The arithmetic of loss reduced to columns on a solicitor's page, her entire life translated into numbers that did not favor her. The letter was from a man she had never met. His name was Gabriel Voss. He was offering to marry her by the end of the week. The solicitor's name was Mr. Harwick, and he had the careful hands of a man accustomed to delivering news that ruined people. He set his documents on her father's desk, already belonging to creditors and everything but the paperwork, and folded those careful hands together and looked at Evelyn with an expression she recognized as practiced sympathy, the kind worn by men who felt nothing but understood the social requirement of appearing to. "Your father's debts," Harwick said, "are considerable." "How considerable?" he told her. Evelyn did not sit down. She had made the decision not to sit down before he arrived, understanding that sitting was a form of surrender, that accepting the chair he would inevitably gesture toward was the first capitulation in a series of capitulations that would define the rest of her life if she permitted it. She stood at the window instead, her back to him, watching the elm trees in the lower garden move in the late October wind. They had been planted by her grandfather. They would outlast all of this by centuries and remember none of it. "There are assets," she said. "There were assets. Your father liquidated most of them over the past 3 years. The estate itself carries a mortgage. The townhouse in Paris was sold last spring. What remains is—" Harwick paused, consulting his papers with the thoroughness of a man who wanted to be precise about devastation, not sufficient to settle the outstanding obligations. "What does that mean for me?" "It means, Miss St. Remy, that without an arrangement of some kind you would be left with very little. The house will be claimed. The staff has already been informed. There is perhaps enough to secure modest lodging and—" another pause. "A modest life." She turned from the window then, not because she had decided to look at him, but because looking out had become unbearable, the garden too familiar, too weighted with everything that was ending. She looked at Harwick instead, and she said, "What arrangement?" He produced the letter. It was brief. A man named Gabriel Voss was aware of the Baron St. Remy's passing and the circumstances attending it. He had a property in Normandy. He was in need of a wife. The word used was companion, but Evelyn had lived long enough to understand what companion meant in a legal document, and he was prepared to assume responsibility for a portion of the outstanding debts in exchange for a marriage of convenience. He asked for nothing beyond her presence. He offered, in return, shelter and stability. He did not offer love, and Evelyn respected the letter for its honesty in this. "Who is he?" she said. "A private gentleman. He keeps largely to himself. His affairs are managed through an intermediary." Harwick cleared his throat. "I understand he came into some property through inheritance. He has lived in Normandy for several years. He has no family connections of note, no title, no significant social standing. Then why does he want this?" Harwick looked at her with those practiced eyes and said nothing for a moment. And in that silence, Evelyn understood something she would not fully articulate until much later. That there were men who sought invisibility, who chose obscurity with the same deliberateness that other men chose power, and that the choosing of obscurity, when the man doing the choosing had the bearing and the means to choose otherwise, was itself a form of information. "I couldn't say," Harwick said finally. "I only know that his offer is genuine and that it is the only offer you are likely to receive." She looked at the letter again. The handwriting was composed, not the handwriting of a man with no education, no refinement. The sentences were clean, economical, without ornamentation. Each word carried its weight and no more. "When does he need an answer?" "He has been patient in waiting. He says by the end of the week." Evelyn folded the letter and held it in both hands. Outside, the elm trees bent in the wind and did not break. She had always admired that about them, the capacity to absorb force without surrendering to it. She had spent most of her life believing she possessed the same capacity. She was about to find out if she had been right. "Tell him yes," she said. "Gats," She met Gabriel Voss for the first time on a Thursday at the solicitor's office, in a room that smelled of old paper and coal smoke. He was already standing when she entered, and that was the first thing she noticed, that he stood before she appeared, that he had risen not in the mechanical way of a man following social protocol, but in the way of a man for whom the gesture was so deeply embedded it required no thought. He was tall, dark-haired. His face was difficult to read in the way that landscapes are difficult to read in flat light, all the features present and correctly arranged, but refusing to yield their meaning. He was dressed plainly: brown wool coat, no ornamentation, boots that were good quality and well-maintained but not expensive. He wore no rings, he carried no cane. There was nothing about him, examined piece by piece, that suggested anything beyond what Harwick had described: a private gentleman of modest means and no social distinction. And yet, Evelyn had spent her entire life in rooms where nobility gathered. She had learned to read its grammar before she could read sentences, the way a certain kind of man occupied space, as though the room had been arranged for his convenience rather than the reverse. The particular stillness of a man who had never been required to fill silence with noise. The way attention moved toward him not because he demanded it, but because it had nowhere else of equal consequence to go. Gabriel Voss did not demand attention. He simply made other things in the room seem less interesting by comparison. "Miss St. Remy," he said. His voice was low. Not soft. There was nothing deferential about it, but measured, in the way of a man who had learned long ago that volume was the instrument of people who doubted whether they would be heard. "Mr. Voss," she said. They looked at each other for a moment across Harwick's cluttered desk, and Evelyn had the uncomfortable sensation of being assessed by someone who was very good at not appearing to assess. His eyes were gray, the particular gray of sky before rain, and they moved over her face with the efficiency of someone cataloging information he intended to use. "I appreciate your willingness to consider my proposal," he said. "I appreciate that you made one," she said. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite amusement, something quieter and more private than amusement. "You're direct," he said. "My circumstances don't leave much room for indirection." "No," he agreed. "I suppose they don't." He gestured toward the chair across from Harwick's desk. "Please." She sat. Not because she had surrendered, she told herself. Because she had assessed the situation and determined that sitting was the correct tactical position. He sat across from her, and Harwick began to explain the terms, and Evelyn watched Gabriel Voss listen. That was what she found herself doing, watching him listen, because in the way a man received information, in the stillness or agitation of his attention, you could learn more than in what he chose to say. Gabriel listened with complete quiet. No fidgeting, no restless arrangement of papers, no small performances of patience. He simply listened, and when Harwick finished, he turned to Evelyn and said, "Is there anything you want to ask me?" She had prepared questions, practical questions about the house, about the arrangements, about what would be expected of her. She asked none of them. "Why do you want a wife you don't know?" she said. He was quiet for a beat. "I need someone capable of managing a household and maintaining appearances when necessary. Someone intelligent enough not to require explanations for everything and discreet enough not to offer them." "That's a description of a capable employee." "It is," he agreed. "The difference is that an employee can leave, and a wife cannot." "Not without considerable difficulty," he said, "which serves both our interests. You need security, I need permanence. The arrangement provides both." "What you're describing has nothing to do with marriage." "No," he said, "it doesn't." She studied him. He returned her gaze without flinching, without the small defensive adjustments most people made when examined too directly. He simply let her look, the way a man lets a storm pass, knowing the storm will eventually stop and the landscape will remain. "All right," she said. They were married 2 days later. Bog. The journey to Normandy took most of a day. They sat across from each other in the carriage, and Gabriel read, not in the performative way of a man demonstrating disinterest, but in the genuine, absorbed way of a man to whom books were not accessories but necessities. He turned pages without awareness of her, and Evelyn, who had packed 2 novels and opened neither, spent the hours watching the landscape change from city gray to autumn gold, and occasionally, when she could do it without being caught, watching him. His hands were wrong. That was the thought that kept returning to her, arranging itself around the other observations she was accumulating. His hands were wrong for a man with no education, no title, no social standing. They were the hands of someone who had worked outdoors in recent years. There was a particular roughness to them, a history of physical labor she had not expected. But beneath that recent history was an older one. The way he held a book, the precise, unconscious elegance of the grip, the hands of a man who had been taught, from the time he could hold anything, to hold everything correctly. She looked at his coat again. The wool was plain, yes, undistinguished, but it had been made by someone who understood the body it would clothe. The shoulders sat the way shoulders sat only on bespoke work. The cut was too good for its materials. Someone had taken an expensive training and applied it to inexpensive cloth, and the result was a disguise that would fool most people. It did not fool her. She was still deciding what to do with this information when the carriage turned down a long drive lined with bare October chestnuts, and she saw the house. Passing. It was larger than she had expected. Not large in the manner of showplaces. It didn't announce itself, didn't organize the landscape around its own importance the way houses built by men with new money did. It was old. 3 centuries of Normandy weather had worked at the stone facade and left it the color of iron and chalk, the kind of gray that absorbs light rather than reflecting it. The windows were tall and numerous. A formal garden had once existed in front. She could see the bones of it, the geometric will of its original design still legible beneath years of neglect. 2 stone figures flanked the main entrance, eroded past recognition by time. Whatever they had once represented, they had become simply the idea of guardians. She heard Gabriel exhale. It was nearly inaudible. A controlled sound, a sound so quickly recovered from that she almost doubted she'd heard it at all. She glanced at him. He was looking at the house with an expression that was, for the first time since she had met him, not entirely composed. Something underneath the surface, moving too quickly to identify. "Home," she said. "Close enough," he said. The carriage stopped. A woman came out of the house. 60s, efficient movements, the particular competence of someone who had spent her life in service and refused to waste any of it. She introduced herself as Mrs. Fontaine, housekeeper, and she welcomed them with a warmth directed almost entirely at Gabriel. And when she spoke to him, she called him Mr. Voss with a precision that was almost too exact, the way people say a name when they are being careful not to say another one. Gabriel spoke to her briefly, quietly, in French so fluent it carried no detectable effort. Not the French of a man who had studied it. The French of a man who had grown up inside it. Evelyn filed this alongside the coat and the hands and the way he stood. The house was larger inside than its exterior had promised. The entrance hall rose 2 floors, stone floor, dark oak paneling, a staircase that divided at the first landing and curved up both sides with a structural confidence that spoke of an architect who had understood this house was meant to last forever. The furniture was sparse, either sold or removed or never replaced. There were pale rectangles on the walls where paintings had once hung, the wallpaper around them a shade darker, preserved from fading by the frames that were no longer there. Whatever had lived in this house before Gabriel had taken most of itself away. "It needs work," Gabriel said behind her. "Yes," she agreed. "The east wing is largely disused. Mrs. Fontaine will show you your rooms. The kitchen is functional. The library is," the briefest hesitation, "available to you. I ask only that you don't go into the rooms at the end of the north corridor. The floor is unsafe." "Unsafe," she repeated. "Structurally compromised. I'm having it assessed." She turned to look at him. He was watching her with that gray, careful attention, and she understood they were no longer talking about floors. "Of course," she said. The first week passed in the manner of all beginnings that are not really beginnings, but rather the negotiated transition from one form of uncertainty to another. Evelyn explored the house, the part she was permitted to explore, and found in it the accumulated evidence of a life that had been deliberately erased. The empty walls, the missing objects, the books in the library with no names on the fly leaves, personal inscriptions cut away with the precise violence of someone who had decided the past required surgery rather than burial. She found, on her second morning, a writing desk in her room that was too beautiful for a private gentleman's house. The inlay work was extraordinary, ivory and ebony and geometric patterns so refined they could only have come from someone commissioned to make something exceptional. There was no maker's mark. The provenance had been removed, if it had ever existed. She said nothing about it. Gabriel ate with her at dinner, and they talked. Not about anything that mattered: the estate, the local farms, the state of the roads after autumn rain, the books she had found in the library. But they talked, and she began to understand the texture of him. He was not cold. That had been her first impression, and she revised it by the fourth day. He was protected. There was a difference. Cold was an absence of warmth. Protected was warmth that had learned to distrust its own existence. He asked her questions about herself with genuine attention, not politeness. He listened to her answers and stored them and referred back to them. 3 days after she mentioned that her mother had died when Evelyn was 9, he brought her a book of botanical illustrations from the library, saying he'd noticed she spent time in the garden and thought she might find it useful, and it was only later that she realized her mother had been an amateur botanist, that the connection was not accidental. He noticed things. He remembered what he noticed. He used what he remembered not to control but to attend. It was, she thought, the most dangerous quality she had ever encountered in a person. What? The first sign was the horse. Gabriel rode most mornings, and on the 5th day she watched him from her bedroom window because she happened to be standing there when he came out of the stable. The horse was a dark bay, large, the kind of animal that required significant management. Gabriel mounted it in a single fluid motion that had no drama in it, no performance, the way people do things they have done 10,000 times. He walked the horse out to the drive, and then, for a moment before they moved into the tree line, he stopped. He sat on the horse the way only certain men sat on horses. Not like a rider. Like someone for whom riding was simply one of the basic modes of being in the world. As natural as walking, something absorbed before memory. She had seen men sit on horses like that exactly 3 times in her life. All 3 of them were dukes. Yes. By the 2nd week, she had begun keeping a mental list. The way he used his knife at dinner, not incorrectly, not ostentatiously, but with the absolute unthinking precision of someone for whom correct table form was a first language. The way he addressed the 2 farmhands who worked the grounds, not with the false friendliness of a man trying to appear common, but with the exact degree of respect and directness that an aristocrat who had been raised by decent people would use with working men. The way he stood near open fires, always slightly to one side, always turned to see the room. The habit of a man who had spent years in rooms where he needed to see who was entering. The locked door at the end of the north corridor. She walked past it on the 8th day. She was not trying to be subtle about it. She had decided that being subtle in her own house was a form of self-diminishment she couldn't afford. She simply walked past it and stopped and put her hand flat on the door and felt nothing useful. Wood, iron latch, the faint smell, familiar but not quite identifiable, that she associated with old portraits, oil paint, and time. She walked away. But she remembered the smell. Matang. The inspector arrived without warning on a Wednesday morning. He came in a hired carriage, a man of perhaps 50, thin in the way of men who forgot to eat, wearing a coat that announced Paris the way accents announced origins, by its quality, its cut, the particular shade of black that provincial coats never quite achieved. He introduced himself to Mrs. Fontaine as Inspector Devereux, here on a matter of administrative inquiry, and he asked if Mr. Voss was available. Evelyn heard this from the landing. She had been coming down for breakfast and had stopped at the sound of an unfamiliar voice, and from above she watched the scene unfold. Devereux in the entrance hall, his small, careful eyes moving over the empty walls, the pale rectangles, the structural absences, with the practiced inventory of a man who catalogued missing things for a living. Mrs. Fontaine said she would fetch Mr. Voss. Devereux turned slowly in the entrance hall, and his eyes moved to the staircase, and he looked up, and for a moment before Evelyn could decide whether to continue down or return to her room, their eyes met. His expression was unreadable. Hers, she hoped, was equivalent. She came down. Madame Voss, she said, extending her hand with the precision of a woman who had been doing this since she was 4 years old. Inspector Devereux, my husband mentioned you might come. He had not mentioned any such thing. Devereux took her hand and bowed correctly and said, Your husband expected me? He mentioned inquiries, she said, which could mean anything. Please, sit. I'll have tea sent. Gabriel appeared in 11 minutes. She counted. He came from the direction of the stables, still in his outdoor coat, and he did not appear surprised to find an inspector in his sitting room. He appeared, if anything, less surprised than a man who had been warned should reasonably appear. He shook Devereux's hand. Their eyes met and held for exactly the amount of time that two men hold each other's gaze when they have something to establish. Inspector, Gabriel said. Mr. Voss, Devereux said, I appreciate you seeing me. I'll be brief. I'm making inquiries on behalf of the ministry into the whereabouts of a man who disappeared some years ago. He produced a folder of papers, opened it, and placed it on the low table between them. His family believes him deceased. There are others who are less certain. His estates have been in administrative suspension, and the ministry is attempting to resolve the matter before the matter becomes, the ghost of a word, complicated. Who is the man? Gabriel said. Devereux looked at him with the flat patience of a man who had done this many times. His name, he said, was Edouard Caedric Aurélien Montfort, Duke of Almer. He paused. He was 29 when he disappeared. He would be 38 now. Approximately your age, Mr. Voss. In the silence that followed, Evelyn heard the fire settle, a log dropping lower in the grate. She did not look at Gabriel. She looked at her hands folded in her lap and waited. I wouldn't know anything about a missing duke, Gabriel said. His voice was unchanged, completely unchanged, the voice of a man who had been asked about the weather. Of course not, Devereux said. I'm simply gathering information, speaking with people in the region who might have noticed. He gestured vaguely. Anything of interest. The Duke was known to have had connections to this part of Normandy. This is a rural area, Gabriel said. People keep to themselves. They do, Devereux agreed. He closed his folder. He stood. The entire exchange had taken less than 10 minutes, and Evelyn had the unshakable sense that nothing in it had been accidental, that Devereux had arrived knowing something and had left knowing something more, and that the two things were different. She walked him to the door herself. At the threshold, Devereux stopped and turned, and he looked at her, not unkindly, but with that same flat assessment he had brought to everything else in the room. And he said quietly enough that his voice didn't carry, Madame Voss, if you ever wish to speak to me directly, about anything at all, you may reach me at the Hôtel du Commerce in Bayeux. I'll be there through the end of the month. She held his gaze. Thank you, Inspector. I'll keep that in mind. He left. She stood in the doorway and watched his carriage until it was gone, and then she stood there a moment longer with the cold November air on her face, and she thought about the name he had said. Edouard Caedric Aurélien Montfort. She thought about how long and formal that name was, how it accumulated history with each syllable, how it was exactly the kind of name that belonged on the genealogical chart she had studied as a girl. The great houses of France, their ducal lines going back 3 centuries, Valmer one of the oldest and most distinguished among them. She thought about the smell behind the locked door. Oil paint and time. Portraits. She thought about the pale rectangles on every wall of this house, the systematic removal of everything that might identify who had lived here before. She went back inside. Gabriel was standing at the window in the sitting room, his back to her, his hands behind him, watching the drive where the carriage had been. He heard her enter and did not turn. He'll come back, Evelyn said. Yes, Gabriel said, he will. Is there anything I should know, she said, before he does? A long silence. Outside, the wind moved through the chestnut trees, the fire crackled. The house made its old settling sounds, the sounds of stone and timber accommodating centuries of weather. No, he said. She looked at his back, at the set of his shoulders, at the way he stood at the window, the way she had noticed him standing near fires. Not to observe the landscape, but to watch the road. All right, she said. She left him there and went upstairs. And that night she lay in the beautiful writing desk's room and stared at the ceiling and thought about everything she had noticed and everything she had filed and everything she had chosen not to say. And she thought about the locked door at the end of the north corridor and the smell of old portraits behind it, and she made a decision. She made it quietly, without ceremony, the way she had made every important decision in her life. Not because she had to, not because she was desperate, but because she had married a man who was lying to her, and she intended to find out exactly who she had married. She waited 3 days. She waited because she was not reckless. She had never been reckless. Her father had called her the most patient person he had ever known. Once, when she was 12 and had spent 6 weeks working out a chess problem he'd told her was unsolvable. She had solved it. Patience was not passivity. It was the refusal to move before you understood the terrain. On the third day, Gabriel rode out at 9 in the morning and did not return until past midday. Mrs. Fontaine was occupied in the kitchen. The 2 farmhands were in the lower fields. Evelyn went to the door at the end of the north corridor. It was locked, as she had expected. But locks in old houses were old, and old locks were made with assumptions about who would be allowed to try them that no longer applied. She had found, in her exploration of the house, a ring of household keys in a kitchen drawer. The administrative detritus of a house that had once been fully staffed, keys to rooms whose purposes had been forgotten, hanging together with no particular order. She had taken note of the ring 3 days ago. She retrieved it now. The third key she tried turned in the lock. The door swung inward on well-oiled hinges. Someone maintained this room, whatever else about the house had been abandoned, and she stood in the threshold and looked at what was inside, and she stood there for a long time without moving. The room was a gallery, not large, but organized with the care of something curated rather than stored. Perhaps 20 portraits, framed in heavy gilt that had been polished recently, hung on all 4 walls from floor to ceiling in the manner of a formal ancestral gallery. They were painted in different centuries, so she could see the evolution of costume and style across the paintings, but they shared something. The faces, not identical, but clearly related. The same long jaw, the same gray eyes, the particular gray of sky before rain, the same quality of stillness in the subject, that sense of a person who had been accustomed all their lives to being painted. At the far end of the gallery, illuminated by a single high window, hung the largest portrait. It was a man of perhaps 30, painted in formal dress. Military medals, a sash she recognized as ducal, bearing she could only describe as absolute. He was not looking at the painter. He was looking slightly to the left, at something beyond the frame, with an expression that carried, even through 2 dimensions and whatever years had passed since it was made, a complex weight she had no single word for. Responsibility? Grief. The look of a man who understood what his name required of him and had not yet decided if he was willing to pay it. The face was Gabriel's. The face was unmistakably, undeniably Gabriel's face, younger by perhaps 8 years, unmarked by whatever the intervening years had marked him with. But his. The jaw, the gray eyes, the particular shape of the nose, the set of the mouth, that quality of restrained expression that she had spent 3 weeks misreading as coldness and only recently begun to understand as the architecture of someone who had built careful walls. Beneath the portrait, on a small placard she had to step forward to read, were the words, Edouard Cédric Aurélien Montfort, Duke of Valmere, 1851. She heard the front door open. She heard in the entrance hall below the sound of boots on stone, Gabriel's particular footfall, which she had already learned without intending to, and then voices, his and Mrs. Fontaine's, exchanging something brief and quiet. Then footsteps on the staircase, coming toward the north corridor. Evelyn stood in front of the portrait of the man who was her husband and felt the blood in her chest doing something that was not quite fear and not quite triumph, but contained elements of both. The sensation of a gamble paying out in a currency she hadn't entirely understood she was gambling for. The footsteps stopped. She turned. Gabriel, Edouard, whoever he was, stood in the doorway of his own gallery, looking at her standing in front of his own face, and for the first time since she had met him, the composed surface broke entirely. What was underneath it was not what she had expected. It was not anger. It was not the cold calculation she had been bracing for. What moved across his face in that unguarded moment before he rebuilt the walls was something she recognized with a shock of clarity that made her grip the edge of the nearest painting for balance. It was relief, the expression of a man who had been carrying a secret for so long that being found out felt, in this first terrible instant, like being put down. Then it closed over. The composed mask returned. He looked at her for a long moment across the gallery of his ancestors, and she looked back at him. And the thing that had been between them since the beginning, the negotiated distance, the careful arrangement of two strangers sharing a house, shifted irrevocably on its foundations. "How long," he said, "have you known?" "I've suspected," she said, "since the second day." He said nothing for a moment. His eyes moved to the portrait behind her, his younger self, formal and weighted with everything his name had required, and then back to her. And something in his expression was the look of a man taking inventory of a situation he had believed was controlled, and finding it was not. "The floor is not actually unsafe," he said. "No," she agreed. "I didn't think it was." He stepped into the gallery. He crossed to the portrait and stood beside her and looked up at it. And she stood beside him and looked at it too. And for a long time neither of them said anything, the two of them facing that younger face with its unresolved weight, its backward glance at something out of frame. "What are you going to do?" he said. And that was the question, wasn't it? That was the question that contained all the other questions, that held in its four words the entirety of what she was now holding, the information, the power it conferred, the decision about what kind of woman she was going to be in this particular moment of this particular life she had not chosen but had accepted. She thought about Devereaux at the Hotel du Commerce in Bayeux. She thought about what she could do with what she now knew, the debts it could settle, the future it could buy. She thought about the way Gabriel had listened when she talked, the botanical book, the writing desk that was too beautiful for its context, the particular quality of a man who had spent years trying to be no one and had not quite succeeded. "I haven't decided," she said. And it was the most honest thing she had said since she arrived, and they both knew it. And in the silence of the gallery full of his ancestors' faces, Evelyn Street, Remy understood that whatever happened next, nothing in this house would ever be arranged between them in quite the same way again. And then she heard it. Below them, in the entrance hall, the unmistakable sound of the front door opening. Not Mrs. Fontaine. The housekeeper never entered that way after midday. Not the farmhands. Their work kept them in the lower fields until 4. A voice she did not recognize. Male. Authoritative. Speaking in French with the clipped vowels of Paris, of official business, of a man who was accustomed to entering houses and finding things that were not intended to be found. Gabriel's entire body changed. It was not dramatic. It was the opposite of dramatic. He became very still, in the way of a man who has been still before in situations that required it. And the color drained from his face with a controlled, deliberate quality that suggested the body acting from deep-trained instinct rather than surprise. He turned to look at her. In his gray eyes, his eyes, the Duke of Valmere's eyes, the eyes in the portrait above them, was not the measured composure she had spent 3 weeks studying. What was there now was older and harder and absolutely unambiguous. He was afraid. Not of her. Of whoever was standing in his entrance hall. "Evelyn," he said. It was the first time he had used her name without the formal prefix, and the sound of it in his voice, stripped of its social architecture, was a different thing entirely, intimate and urgent and freighted with 3 weeks of proximity that had been building toward exactly this kind of sentence. "There are men downstairs who cannot know I'm here." He stopped. He looked at her, with everything that look contained, all its complicated ask, all its acknowledgement of what it was requiring of a woman who owed him nothing, who had married him under false pretenses, who was standing in his secret room in possession of every piece of information he had spent years concealing. "Please," he said. And the words sat in the gallery with them, weightless and enormous at the same time, and Evelyn looked at him and looked at the portrait of the man he had once been and looked at the door through which the voices were becoming louder and more numerous, and she made the second important decision of her life in this house. She moved toward the door. She moved toward the door. Not running, not performing calm either. something between the two. The particular pace of a woman who had decided something and was now executing the decision before the decision could argue with itself. Gabriel caught her arm. Not hard, barely a touch, really, but she stopped. "There is a back staircase," he said, low and exact, "through the door behind the last portrait on the left. It comes out through the kitchen passage. If you go now, you were never in this part of the house." She looked at his hand on her arm. He released it. "And you," she said. "I'll come down through the main stairs. I was in the study." The composure was back, rebuilt in the 30 seconds since it had cracked, and she would have marveled at the speed of it, except that she was beginning to understand that the composure was not a mask worn over something softer. It was armor worn over something that had already been through the fire. "Tell Mrs. Fontaine I asked for coffee. You want me to provide your alibi? I want you to have a reason for being in the kitchen that requires no explanation." She looked at him for one more second, at the gray eyes, the controlled face, the man who had just said please to her in a way that had cost him something real. And then she turned and went through the door behind the last portrait on the left, and the door closed behind her, and she was in darkness and the smell of old timber, and she found the staircase by feel and went down. The kitchen was warm. Mrs. Fontaine looked up from the bread she was covering and took in Evelyn's presence with the expressionless competence of a woman who had spent her life not asking questions that weren't her business. "Mr. Voss asked for coffee," Evelyn said. "I'll bring it through," Mrs. Fontaine said. Evelyn sat at the kitchen table, which was not what ladies did in households with any pretension to proper arrangement, and Mrs. Fontaine did not comment on this, and they both listened to the sounds coming from the entrance hall. 3 voices now, she counted, and from the direction and echo she understood they had moved into the sitting room, and Evelyn put her hands flat on the kitchen table and breathed. Her hands were steady. She noticed this with something that was not quite pride and not quite surprise, but sat in the territory between them. She had always known, in the abstract way people know things about themselves before circumstances test the knowledge, that she was not a person who panicked. She had not known, until this moment, that she was a person who could walk out of a secret gallery containing the hidden identity of her husband of 3 weeks and sit in a kitchen and simply breathe. The question was what that said about her, whether it was strength or whether it was the specific numbness of a person who had already lost everything once and found that having nothing to protect was its own form of freedom. She thought about her father's house, the men carrying boxes, Harwick's careful hands. She thought about the letter, its clean sentences, its refusal of sentiment. She thought about Gabriel, Edouard, standing in front of his own portrait, and the particular quality of the fear in his eyes, and the way please had come out of him like something expensive. Mrs. Fontaine poured coffee and said nothing and went to the far side of the kitchen and began quietly dismantling something that needed dismantling, and Evelyn sat with her steady hands and waited. 14 minutes later, Gabriel appeared in the kitchen doorway. He looked at her. She looked at him. His face gave her nothing, which she was beginning to understand was itself a form of information. The nothing face was the face of a man managing a situation that had not resolved in the way he needed. "They want to speak with you," he said. "I assumed they would." "You don't have to I know I don't have to." She stood. "What are their names?" "The one who speaks is called Renaud. He's not an inspector. He's a ministry solicitor. The other 2 are," a fractional pause, "escorts." She heard what he didn't say. She nodded and smoothed her dress and walked past him toward the sitting room, and he followed, and she felt him behind her in the corridor. Not close, not touching, but present in the way a person was present when they were watching you in place of being able to do anything else. Renaud was a small man with the energetic self-importance of someone who had accumulated authority through proximity to power rather than the possession of it. He stood when she entered and performed a bow that was technically correct and felt like a negotiating position. "Madame Voss," he said, "I apologize for the intrusion." "Not at all," Evelyn said. She sat without being invited to, choosing the chair that put her back to the window and her face in shadow, the chair that required Renaud to look into the light to address her. "How can I help you, monsieur?" Renaud registered the chair arrangement. His eyes moved to it and away again, and she could see him revising something. I'm making inquiries on behalf of the Ministry of Estates into a matter of the Duke of Valmere, she said. Silence. Behind her, near the door, she heard Gabriel's breathing shift. Renaud's small eyes narrowed fractionally. You're familiar with the matter. An inspector named Devereaux came through last week with a similar inquiry. He mentioned the name. She let that settle. Let Renaud understand that she was giving him information she didn't have to give, letting him understand she chose to give it, that she was operating from a position of choice rather than exposure. I told him the same thing I'll tell you. We're private people here. My husband manages the estate and has little contact with the outside world. I've seen no one of interest since our arrival. And before your arrival, Renaud said, did you know your husband had any connection to this region, to the Valmere estates specifically? My husband's family history is his own business, she said, as is mine. We were married 6 weeks ago under circumstances I imagine you're already familiar with, given the thoroughness of your inquiry. I don't know why you believe Mr. Voss has any connection to a missing nobleman, and I'll confess the entire line of questioning strikes me as rather extraordinary for an estate matter. She looked at Renaud with the expression she had spent 22 years learning in rooms full of people who would use any weakness they could find. Is there something specific you came here to ask, or is this purely procedural? Renaud looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked past her at Gabriel. Mr. Voss, he said, you've lived in this house for how long? 4 years, Gabriel said from behind her. His voice was steady, not performing steadiness. The distinction mattered, and she had learned to hear it. This was the real thing, the control of a man who had rehearsed this particular interrogation inside himself so many times that the actual version required less effort. And before that, I traveled, various parts of France, Switzerland for a period. Switzerland. Renaud wrote something in a small notebook, and the writing felt theatrical, the gesture of a man whose real instrument was observation, not documentation. And your family? Dead, Gabriel said. My father died when I was young. My mother followed some years ago. I have no siblings. No other family connections. No. The word landed with a finality that ended questions rather than answering them, and Renaud heard it and assessed it and made a small decision behind his eyes that Evelyn watched him make. Of course, Renaud said. He closed the notebook. He looked at Evelyn. Madame Voss, I hope you understand that this is simply administrative. The ministry has an obligation to resolve the status of a significant estate. There are claimants, legal complications. It's tedious business. I'm sure it is, she said. If you think of anything, we'll be in touch, she said. She stood when he stood, and she walked him to the door with the same precise warmth she had used on Devereaux, and she watched the three of them get into their carriage, and she watched the carriage until it was gone, and then she stood in the doorway for a moment with the cold November air on her face, and this time it was not just the cold she was processing. It was the fact that she had lied. Not in the legal sense. She hadn't said anything demonstrably false, had been careful about that, had chosen each sentence the way you chose each step on uncertain ground. But she had constructed a shelter. She had put herself between Gabriel and the men looking for him, and she had done it without hesitation, and she needed to understand why. She heard him behind her. They'll come back, he said. Same thing she'd said to him about Devereaux. Yes, she said. They won't stop. I know. Evelyn? She turned around. He was standing in the entrance hall, and he looked for the first time since she had met him, for the first time in all the composed and careful weeks of their arrangement, like a man who didn't know what to do next. Not helpless. That wasn't the word. More like a person standing at a junction where every road was known to them and none of the roads were good. You didn't have to do that, he said. I know that too, she said. I haven't given you... He stopped. Something moving in the careful architecture of his face. I've given you no reason. She thought about how to answer that. She stood in the doorway of the house that was his and hers, and neither, and she thought about what a reason was. Whether it was an argument you made or a series of small, consistent acts accumulated over time. The botanical book, the writing desk, the way he stood at windows. Tell me something true, she said. He looked at her. One thing, she said. You don't have to tell me everything. I'm not asking for everything. But tell me one true thing right now, and I'll know whether to stay. The silence lasted long enough that she counted her own heartbeats. 8, 9. My mother died in this house, he said. She was the last person who knew where I was. When she died, I became... He looked past her at the drive where the carriage had been. I became the only person in the world who knew I was still alive. There is a particular kind of freedom in that, and a particular kind of hell. I have not been entirely sure, in the years since, which one I was living in. The entrance hall held the silence after he finished speaking. Evelyn looked at him for a long time, at the gray eyes, at the face that had spent years learning to give nothing away and had just given her something real. All right, she said. She meant it in the same way she had meant it in Harwick's office, when she had agreed to marry a stranger. The same quality of decision made in full clarity, without sentiment, without the delusion that she understood everything she was agreeing to. She went inside. He followed. That night she sat at the beautiful writing desk and did not write anything. She sat with the candle in the dark outside the window and the sounds of the house settling around her, and she thought about what she was holding and what it weighed and what it was worth, and she understood that she had crossed something today that she could not uncross. Not the gallery, not the knowledge of who he was. Those were discoveries. What she had crossed today was something she had done, a choice made in a kitchen and in a sitting room and in a doorway, and choices were the only things in life that couldn't be revised by circumstance. Everything else, inheritance, name, money, loss, could be taken. What you had chosen, you kept. She thought about Devereux at the Hôtel du Commerce. She thought about Renault's notebook. She thought about the men who would come back because men like that always came back, and she thought about Gabriel standing at his own junction with no good roads. She thought about what she had just signed herself into, without being asked, without negotiation, without the protection of explicit terms. She blew out the candle. In the dark, she heard footsteps in the corridor. Gabriel's. She knew his footfall now without trying. And they stopped outside her door, and she waited for a knock that didn't come. Just the pause. Just the sound of a man standing outside a door, deciding something, and then deciding not to decide it yet. The footsteps moved on. She lay back in the dark and stared at the ceiling she couldn't see, and she thought, he is running from something that has not finished chasing him. And she had just told it clearly, with her body and her choices and her careful sentences in the sitting room, that it would have to come through her first. She had no idea, yet, what that would cost. But she had begun, for the first time since she had arrived at this house, to understand that the cost would be real. That the thing chasing Gabriel Voss, Edouard Montfort, Duke of Valmere, was not the abstract threat of administrative inconvenience or bureaucratic persistence. She understood this the next morning, because the next morning she came downstairs to find Gabriel already at the table with a letter in his hands, reading it with the stillness of a man who had received news he had spent years expecting and dreading in equal measure. He looked up when she entered. The controlled face was back, fully assembled, but underneath it, in the particular set of his jaw, in the almost imperceptible tension around his eyes, was something that moved through her chest like cold water. "What is it?" she said. He put the letter on the table between them. She picked it up. It was from Paris, formal ministry letterhead. The language was bureaucratic and precise, and underneath all its administrative scaffolding said one thing: Edouard Caedric Aurélien Montfort, Duke of Valmere, was formally required to present himself to the Ministry of Justice within 30 days to answer questions regarding the administration of the Valmere estate. Failure to appear would constitute legal abandonment of the title and all associated lands, properties, and entitlements, which would then pass to the secondary claimants. Secondary claimants. Two words that sat at the bottom of the letter like a stone dropped into water, and Evelyn looked at Gabriel, and Gabriel looked at the letter, and neither of them spoke for a moment. "Who are the secondary claimants?" she said. He picked up his coffee, drank, put it down. In the ordinary quiet of these gestures was the absolute absence of surprise, The particular calm of a man receiving confirmation of something he had known was coming for a long time. "The men," he said, "who destroyed my family in the first place." And she set the letter down, and she looked at him across the breakfast table in the house where his mother had died, and she felt the last door between where she had been and where she was going close behind her with a weight she recognized as the specific gravity of having made an irreversible choice. There was no going back from this. There had not been, she realized, since the moment she had walked out of that kitchen and into the sitting room and said the Duke of Valmere before Renaud could say it himself. She had not understood then what she was doing. She understood it now. "Tell me about them," she said. "Tell me about them," she said. Gabriel looked at the letter for a moment longer, then pushed it to one side with the deliberate movement of a man setting down something he intended to pick up again only when he was ready. He got up from the table and went to the window, and he stood there with his back to her, and she waited, and the house waited around them both, and outside the November fields were flat and gray and going nowhere. "His name is Minister Colbert," he said. "Armand Colbert. He was my father's closest advisor for 15 years. He sat at our table every Christmas. He taught me how to play chess when I was 7 because my father was too busy and Colbert was always there, always present, always the man who knew where everything was and how everything worked." A pause. "My father trusted him completely, the kind of trust that stops being a choice and becomes a fact of the world, like weather, like geography." Evelyn said nothing. She understood that this was not the kind of telling that benefited from responses. This was the kind a person did while looking out windows at flat gray fields. "My father died when I was 24. Not of illness, not of accident. He died of a financial collapse that consumed the Valmere estate in 18 months, that stripped every asset, called every debt, sold every property that had been in my family for 300 years. He died in a house that had been remortgaged 3 times without his knowledge, against accounts that had been siphoned for a decade before anyone looked closely enough to see it." He turned. "Colbert managed all of it, the accounts, the investments, the legal instruments. He managed it the way a careful man manages something he intends to eventually own." "He stole from your father?" "He stole my father's entire life, and then he arranged very cleanly to be appointed the ministry official overseeing the estate dissolution." Gabriel came back to the table and sat, and she watched the controlled quality of each movement, the way he kept himself assembled through the specific discipline of doing ordinary things correctly. He was positioned to acquire the Valmere holdings at a fraction of their value through a proxy company. The arrangement was elegant, the kind of thing that looks like misfortune if you don't look too closely. But you looked. My mother looked. She was the one who understood what had happened. She spent 2 years after my father's death tracing every document, every transfer, every legal instrument. She had the mind for it. She had always been sharper than anyone in those rooms gave her credit for, because she was a woman in those rooms. Something shifted in his face. She compiled everything, names, dates, amounts, the complete mechanism of it. She brought it to me when I was 27, 2 years before the arranged marriage. What arranged marriage? He looked at her across the table. Colbert's daughter, he said. The marriage was proposed before my father died, presented as a natural alliance. After my father's death, it became pressure. The kind of pressure that comes with the implication that accepting it would resolve outstanding complications and declining it would create new ones. It was an acquisition. He wanted the name, the title, whatever remained of the Valmere reputation. His daughter would become a duchess. His family would attach itself to mine, and I would spend the rest of my life providing cover for what he had done. Evelyn looked at him. She thought about the portrait in the gallery, the young man looking at something outside the frame. She thought about what that look carried, not just the weight of the title, but the specific weight of a man who could see what was happening to him clearly and was still deciding whether he had the will to refuse it. You refused, she said. I was 27 and my mother was dying and Colbert had every legal instrument necessary to bury us if I did. He had spent years building the position. He owned people in the ministry. He owned the men who would hear any complaint I made. The evidence my mother had compiled was real, but it was nothing. It was paper, and paper burns. His hands were flat on the table. She looked at them, the hands that were wrong for the life he was pretending to have. I understood that if I fought him openly, I would lose. I understood it the way you understand something that you've already turned over 10,000 times, and it comes up the same answer every time. So you disappeared. I arranged my death. A riding accident, remote terrain, no body recovered. My mother was the only person who knew the truth. She helped me because she understood that a living Edouard Montfort with no power was worth more to the future than a destroyed one. She died 8 months later. He stopped. The silence had a different weight than the other silences in this conversation, this one carrying something he was not going to fully articulate and did not need to. I came here. This was her property, held in her name, separate from the Valmer estate, never part of the dissolution. It was the one thing Colbert couldn't take. Evelyn looked around the room, the empty walls, the pale rectangles, the systematic erasure of everything that could identify who had lived here. She understood it all differently now, not as the concealment of a fugitive, but as the grief work of a man who had buried himself in order to survive, who had stripped his own history from the walls because living inside it was unbearable and outside it was the only place left. He's using the ministry, she said. He is the ministry. He has been for 6 years. The secondary claimants mentioned in that letter are his proxies. He's been patient, more patient than I expected. But 30 days is not patience. Gabriel looked at the letter. 30 days is a clock. She picked the letter up again and read it through a second time, slowly. The formal language, the administrative scaffolding. The particular phrasing of failure to appear will constitute legal abandonment. If you appear, she said, you confirm you're alive. Every legal protection you have from the death record dissolves. He can have you taken. Yes. If you don't appear, you lose the title, the estate, everything your mother preserved. Yes. And if the estate passes to his proxies, then Colbert owns the last thing my family had, and the only evidence of what he did, the documents my mother compiled, which are in this house, becomes inaccessible. The chain of custody breaks. He walks away clean. He paused. He has always walked away clean. It is his primary talent. Evelyn set the letter down. She sat with what he had told her and felt it settle into its full shape, the complete architecture of it, the 15 years of patience, the systematic destruction, the arranged marriage as final acquisition, the staged death as the only available countermove. She thought about the kind of man who could spend 15 years in another man's house and eat his food and teach his son chess and arrange his ruin with the same steady hand. She thought about what it did to a person to know that such men existed, to have had one central to your entire childhood, to have to hold simultaneously the memory of the man who taught you chess and the knowledge of what that man was. How long have you been waiting, she said, for him to make a move? Gabriel looked at her with the gray eyes that had spent years keeping their own counsel. 4 years, he said. I knew he would eventually. The estate has too much value. He's too patient to let it go entirely. A pause. I didn't expect it to involve a wife. No, she agreed. I imagine you didn't plan for that. Something crossed his face. Not quite apology. More complex than apology. The expression of a man who understood that he had, by necessity and desperation, drawn someone else into a situation they had not consented to, and that this fact had a weight his sense of himself required him to acknowledge. Evelyn, he said. Don't, she said. Not unkindly. I made my own choices. I'm still making them. She looked at the letter. But I need to know something. Your mother's documents. You said they're in this house. Yes. Where? He looked at her for a long moment. The assessment she had noticed on the first day, that efficient catalog of information, but the quality of it had changed. It was no longer the look of a man deciding how much to trust a stranger. It was the look of a man deciding how much to trust someone who had already proven twice in 2 days that they were worth trusting. The room at the end of the north corridor, he said. Not the gallery, the room adjacent to it. The floor is locked. Not unsafe. She almost smiled. I know. She did not go to the room that day. There were other things to manage, a letter to be drafted to the ministry acknowledging receipt both of the formal notice, worded carefully enough to buy time without making commitments, and Gabriel sat at the writing desk in the study while she stood behind him and read each sentence as he wrote it. And twice she said, "Not that, try again." And twice he crossed the sentence out and tried again without argument, and she understood this as a form of trust more significant than anything he had said out loud. The letter went out the following morning. For 3 days, the house held its breath. Evelyn walked the estate. Not aimlessly, she had never done anything aimlessly in her life, but with the specific purpose of understanding what Gabriel was defending, what the Valmir name was actually attached to in physical reality. The land was good. Neglected, yes. The consequence of 4 years of single-handed management with limited resources. But good underneath the neglect in the way some things were good underneath damage, the essential quality intact. The tenant farmers who worked the lower fields touched their hats to her with a respect that was not the performative deference of people managing a powerful landlord, but something quieter and more real. She asked one of them, directly, what they thought of Mr. Voss. The man considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "He's fair," he said finally. "Fair and quiet. Doesn't ask for what's not owed. Fixed the drainage himself last winter. Him and Pierre. Didn't wait to hire anyone." A pause. "That kind of man, you don't ask too many questions about where he comes from." She thought about that as she walked back. The way certain kinds of worth announce themselves through ordinary actions. The drainage. The chess lessons. The way a man who had every reason to become bitter about the betrayal of trust had instead built a life organized around being exactly what Colbert was not. She thought about this, and then she stopped thinking about it because she came over the rise and saw a carriage on the drive that she did not recognize, and her chest tightened with a specific and unpleasant clarity. Not Renault's carriage, not Devereux's. Different horses, different livery, the particular dark blue of official ministry business. She walked faster. Around. Mrs. Fontaine met her at the kitchen door with an expression that had abandoned its usual careful neutrality. "They've been here 20 minutes, she said quietly. "He asked me to find you." "How many?" "4. One speaks. The others—" Mrs. Fontaine's mouth tightened. "The others are not solicitors." Evelyn went through the kitchen and down the corridor and opened the sitting room door without knocking. Gabriel was standing. 4 men arranged around the room with the practiced spatial logic of people who had been trained to occupy rooms in ways that limited options. The one who spoke was not Renault. He was older, broader, with the face of a man who had outlasted several administrations by being useful to whoever was currently in power. He wore the ministry crest on his lapel with the ease of a man who had worn it so long it had become part of his body. His name, she would learn in the next 60 seconds, was Prefect Maubert. And Maubert had not come with a letter. Maubert had come with a warrant. She looked at Gabriel. He looked at her. His face was the composed face, but she had learned to read what the composed face concealed, and what it concealed right now was something she had not seen in him before. Not fear. He had been afraid with Renault and managed it. This was different. This was the particular stillness of a man who has just watched the last exit close. "Madame Voss," Maubert said, turning to her with the practiced courtesy of a man who used courtesy as a form of control, "I apologize for the disruption to your household." "What is this?" she said. "A formality." He produced the warrant, held it toward her with 2 fingers, the gesture of a man who expected it to be taken. "The ministry has received information indicating that the man residing in this property may be the same individual named in the notice of appearance issued last week. We are authorized to detain him for formal identification." "Detain," she said, "for identification purposes only." She looked at the warrant. It was real. She could see that immediately. The seals were correct, the language was correct, the signatures were correct. Someone had moved very quickly, and moving quickly at ministry level required either enormous urgency or enormous influence. And she understood in that moment that the 30-day window in the original letter had never been a genuine offer. It had been a mechanism. A way to confirm that the man in this house was alive and present before sending Maubert. She looked at Gabriel. His hands were behind his back. His face was the face of a man who had run every calculation available to him and arrived at the same answer by every route. "May I see the warrant?" he said. Maubert gave it to him. Gabriel read it with the stillness she had watched him bring to every document, thorough, unhurried, absorbing everything. His eyes moved through the text with the specific literacy of someone who understood exactly what each sentence meant and what space existed between the sentences. She watched his face as he read. She watched the moment he found it. It was small. The composition did not break. But something in the region of his eyes changed, a micro-adjustment, the recalibration of a man who has found information he needed to account for. And when he lowered the warrant and looked at her, she understood without being told that whatever he had found in the document was significant. "One moment," he said to Maubert, with a courtesy that matched Maubert's own. Precise, impersonal, the tone of two men who understood they were adversaries and were maintaining the fiction of civility because it served both of them to do so. He turned to Evelyn. "Could I speak with my wife briefly?" Maubert assessed this. He weighed the disruption against the optics of denying a man a word with his wife in his own house. "Of course," he said. Gabriel took her by the elbow, and they went into the corridor, and he pulled the door 3/4 closed behind them, and he spoke in a voice pitched below the range of anything that could carry through wood and plaster. "The warrant is signed by Colbert," he said. She absorbed this. "He's come out from behind the proxies. He has no reason to hide anymore. If I'm taken to Paris for identification, the death record dissolves the moment I arrive. He controls what happens after that." His hand was still on her elbow, and she did not think he was aware of it. "But that's not the problem." "What's the problem?" "The warrant cites an informant, someone who confirmed my presence here within the last 72 hours. He looked at her with eyes that were doing fast, precise work. Renaud and Devereaux both left before they could have confirmed anything with certainty. The only people in this house who have known the truth for more than 72 hours are... He stopped. She felt something go cold in her stomach. Not the cold of fear, the specific nauseating cold of a conclusion you can see and cannot stop arriving at. "Mrs. Fontaine," she said. The words came out of her quietly, with the quality of something irrevocable. Gabriel's face did not change, but his hand dropped from her elbow. "She's been with this house since my mother's time," he said, and in those 8 words was the entire weight of it. Not just the betrayal, but the particular quality of a betrayal committed by the person who had known the truth longest, who had helped maintain the fiction, who had called him Mr. Voss with such precise care for so many years. Evelyn thought about the warmth Mrs. Fontaine had directed at Gabriel on the first day. Real warmth. She was certain it had been real. She thought about the way a person could hold genuine feeling for someone and genuine fear for themselves simultaneously, and about what Colbert did with fear when he found it. "How long has she been afraid of him?" Evelyn said. Gabriel closed his eyes for 1 second. When he opened them, the gray was flat and deep. "Long enough," he said. She looked at him. At the man who had staged his own death and spent 4 years becoming no one in a house where even the portraits had been hidden, where every wall carried the pale scar of something removed, and who had been undone not by ministry warrants or legal instruments, but by someone who had sat at his table and eaten his bread and known his real name. She understood, in that moment, something about the nature of survival that no amount of careful planning could fully address. That the thing most likely to destroy you was never the enemy you could see coming. It was the person you had stopped watching because you had decided they were safe. "What do we do?" she said. He looked back toward the sitting room door. Through the wood and plaster, 4 men waited with a warrant signed by the man who had destroyed his family, and in the kitchen, preparing something for the evening meal she would never cook now, was a woman who had just made a decision whose weight she was undoubtedly already feeling, and none of this could be undone. "I go with them," he said. "Gabriel, if I run again, the estate falls. Everything my mother preserved falls. Everything she spent the last 2 years of her life documenting falls." His voice was even. The evenness of a man who had arrived somewhere and was now simply describing its coordinates. He planned this. He planned it so that every move available to me leads to the same place. She looked at him. "Then we don't let him decide which move you make." "I don't have another move." "You have me," she said. It came out without strategy, without the careful sentence construction she had deployed against Renaud and again against Maubert. It came out as a plain statement of fact. The way you said it is raining or the road is closed. She heard it herself the way you sometimes heard your own voice from the outside, and she did not take it back. Gabriel looked at her for a long, still moment. In his eyes was something she had no word for. Not gratitude, because gratitude was too small for what was in there, and not hope, because hope implied uncertainty, and what was in his eyes was something beyond uncertainty, something that had been used too hard for too long and was encountering, with the suspicious and fractured attention of exhaustion, the possibility that it didn't have to carry everything alone. "There's a case," he said finally, "in the locked room. Brown leather, my mother's initials, every document she compiled. Names, dates, the complete chain of evidence against Colbert." He held her gaze. "If I go to Paris and they hold me, the case needs to reach someone who can use it before Colbert can move on the estate. Someone outside the ministry." "Who?" "There's a man, a judge. His name is Armand Leclerc. He sat with my father on the appellate court before my father's death. He was never part of Colbert's arrangement. He was never useful enough to be bought, and never powerful enough to be a threat." A breath. "He will be in Paris. He reads the morning brief at Café Tournon on the Rue de Condé. Every morning at 8. She absorbed every word with the attention of someone committing it to memory because her memory was the only safe place for it. "And if I can't reach him in time," she said. Gabriel looked at her with the gray eyes and the face that had spent years learning to give nothing away. And what he gave her now was not a plan, was not strategy, was not the controlled competence she had spent 3 weeks cataloging and filing. What he gave her was the truth. "Then everything my mother died for dies with me," he said. "And Colbert wins. He has always won. He wins because he is willing to use people who love the people he's destroying, and the people being destroyed are never willing to do the same thing back." He opened the sitting room door. Maubert looked up. The four men arranged themselves with the unhurried efficiency of people for whom this particular kind of moment was professional routine. "I'll come with you," Gabriel said to Maubert. "I need 10 minutes to collect some things." "Of course," Maubert said, the courtesy of a man who had already won. Gabriel went upstairs. Evelyn stood in the sitting room with the four men and the weight of the warrant and the knowledge of the brown leather case in the locked room down the north corridor. And she stood very still the way she had stood very still in Harwick's office when the accounting of her life had been laid out in front of her, and she had decided, standing at the window watching the elm trees, that bending was not the same as breaking. She thought about what Gabriel had said. He wins because he is willing to use people who love the people he's destroying. She thought about Mrs. Fontaine in the kitchen, the real warmth on the first day, the precise care with which she said Mr. Voss, the years of it, the fear that had eventually made even that insufficient. She thought about what it meant to be the kind of woman who stood between a man and the thing hunting him, not because she had been asked to, not because she was obligated, but because she had looked at the arithmetic of it and made a decision with her whole self. Gabriel came down with a small bag, nothing that indicated he intended to be gone for more than a day. And he looked at her one last time at the foot of the stairs, and the look contained everything they had not had time to say, everything that had accumulated over 6 weeks of careful proximity and was now compressed into 5 seconds in a corridor. "Café Tournon," she said, "Rue de Condé, 8 in the morning, Judge Leclerc." Something moved across his face. "You don't have to—" "I know," she said. For the third time. The same words, the same tone, the same quality of choice made in full clarity. But this time they meant something different. This time they did not mean I accept the situation. This time they meant I am coming for you. The front door closed behind him. She stood in the entrance hall and listened to the carriage leave, and when it was gone she turned and walked to the kitchen, and Mrs. Fontaine was standing at the counter with her back to the room, and she was very still in the way of a person who knows they are being approached and cannot decide whether to turn around. Evelyn stopped in the doorway. "How much," she said, did he threaten you with?" Mrs. Fontaine's shoulders dropped, just slightly. The drop of a weight carried too long, put down for 1 second before being picked back up. She turned around. Her eyes were dry. She was not a woman who cried, Evelyn understood. Whatever she felt happened below the surface and stayed there. but her face held something that was not quite remorse and not quite justification, but occupied the painful territory between them. "My son," she said. "He has my son. There is a debt. Colbert bought the debt 3 years ago and has been patient with it." She looked at Evelyn without flinching, which Evelyn respected even now. "I did not tell him everything. I told him only that a man matching the description was living here. I told myself that was—" She stopped. "It was not enough. I know that." Evelyn looked at her. She thought about the arithmetic again, about Colbert's method, the patient accumulation of leverage over people who mattered to the people he was destroying, the use of love as a weapon, the conversion of ordinary human attachment into a mechanism of control. She thought about how you fought a man who fought like that. "Get your coat," Evelyn said. "You're going to tell me everything you know about Colbert's Paris operation, and then you're going to help me get to Paris before that carriage arrives." Mrs. Fontaine stared at her. "My husband," Evelyn said with a flat, cold clarity that surprised even herself, "is not going to Paris alone." They left before dawn. Mrs. Fontaine drove. This was not sentiment. It was practicality. The woman knowing every road between Normandy and Paris, the way she knew the rooms of the manor, by feel, by long repetition, by the kind of knowledge that lives in the body rather than the mind. Evelyn sat beside her on the box, with the brown leather case wedged between her feet, and the cold came up from the road in waves, and neither of them spoke for the first hour because the first hour was not for speaking. It was for thinking. Evelyn thought about the journey ahead, and the man already on it, somewhere on the same road in Maubert's carriage, and she thought about what would happen when he arrived in Paris without what she was carrying. She thought about Judge Leclerc at Café Tournant at 8 in the morning, and she thought about how many mornings they had and whether it would be enough. She thought about Colbert, the chess lessons, the Christmas tables, 15 years of patience, and she felt something in her chest that was not fear and not anger, but the cold, functional clarity that came when sentiment had been burned away entirely, and what remained was simply the will to act. She had felt this once before. Standing at her father's window, watching the elm trees, deciding to say yes to a letter from a stranger. She had not understood then that she was practicing for something. The road unrolled in the darkness ahead of them, and the horse's breath made clouds in the freezing air, and somewhere behind them the manor stood empty and full of pale rectangles and a gallery of gray-eyed ancestors who had spent 3 centuries learning that what you were willing to protect determined what you deserved to keep. Mrs. Fontaine talked for the second hour. She talked in the flat, unsentimental way of a person delivering a report rather than a confession. Names, connections, the structure of Colbert's arrangements within the ministry. She had spent 3 years inside the periphery of it, not because she had chosen to, but because Colbert had made her son's debt the price of her silence, and silence had a way of shading into complicity before you noticed the transition. Evelyn listened and stored everything, and she asked questions that were specific and practical and did not contain a single syllable of judgment, because judgment was not useful right now, and she understood that Mrs. Fontaine was not the enemy. Mrs. Fontaine was what happened to people when someone like Colbert found the thing they could not afford to lose. "The men he uses," Evelyn said, "the ones Maubert had with him. Who do they answer to?" "Maubert answers to Colbert directly. The others are ministry guards assigned to his office. They don't know the full arrangement. They know only that Maubert's warrants are good, and his orders come from above." A pause. "There is one man, a solicitor named Vidal. He manages the legal paperwork for the estate transfer. He is the one who has my son's debt documents." "Where is he?" "Paris. Colbert's offices in the 4th arrondissement." Evelyn looked at the road ahead. The sky was beginning to change at its eastern edge. Not light yet, but the absence of pure black, the first gray suggestion of a morning coming whether anyone was ready for it or not. "If those documents could be retrieved," Evelyn said. "My son would be free of it," Mrs. Fontaine said. Her voice was careful and deliberately expressionless, in the way of someone who had learned not to want things out loud, in case wanting them made them more fragile. "Then that's 2 things we need from Paris," Evelyn said. Mrs. Fontaine was quiet for a moment. Then, You are a very unusual woman, Madame Voss. My name is Evelyn Saint Remy, Evelyn said. It was the first time she had used her own name since the marriage, and the sound of it in her own mouth felt like putting on a coat she had thought she'd lost. And I am not unusual. I am simply paying attention. Oh. They arrived at the outskirts of Paris as the city was grinding into its morning configuration. Market carts, delivery horses, the particular controlled chaos of a city that did its real work before the people with offices arrived to claim credit for it. Mrs. Fontaine knew a street near the Rue de Condé where the horse could be managed, and she took them there with the efficiency of a woman who had made this drive before, and Evelyn stepped down from the box with the leather case under her arm and looked at the city that had once been the background of her entire life, and felt absolutely nothing nostalgic about it. The Café Tournon was 3 streets away. She walked. The cold was different in Paris. Damper, carrying the river in it, the particular chill of a city built on water. She walked with the case under her arm and her chin up and the expression of a woman who belonged wherever she happened to be, which was an expression she had worn so long it was no longer performance. The cafe was already open. A narrow room, dark wood, the smell of coffee and fresh bread and old tobacco. 4 tables occupied. At the table near the far window, a man in his 60s sat alone with a newspaper and a small cup, reading with the absorbed quiet of a man for whom this hour was the best part of the day. She sat down across from him without asking. He looked up from his newspaper. His face was the face of a man who had spent decades in law. Careful, watchful, the expression of someone accustomed to assessing situations before deciding how to respond to them. He looked at her, at the case under her arm, at her face. "Judge Leclerc," she said, a beat, "you have me at a disadvantage. My name is Evelyn Saint Remy. My husband is Edouard Montfort." She put the case on the table between them. "He is currently in ministry custody, being transported to Colbert's offices for identification. He told me you were the one man in Paris he trusted, and he told me where to find you, and I have been in a carriage since 4 in the morning, and I need you to tell me right now whether he was right about you." Leclerc looked at her for a long, still moment. Then he looked at the case. "Is this what I think it is?" he said. "Everything his mother compiled, every document, every transfer record, every name in Colbert's arrangement going back 15 years. He put his newspaper down. He put his coffee cup down. He looked at her with the eyes of a man recalibrating very quickly. "How long do we have?" he said. "Maubert's carriage left Normandy yesterday afternoon, assuming a night stop and a morning arrival." She looked at the window, at the early light on the street outside. "Perhaps 2 hours. Perhaps less." Leclerc opened the case. He read fast. The reading of a man who had spent his life in documents, who could extract the essential architecture of a case from its materials the way a surgeon extracted what needed to come out, clean and decisive. His eyes moved down pages with the controlled urgency of someone who understood exactly what he was looking at and what it meant. Twice he stopped and went back and read a section again. Once he closed his eyes for a moment with the expression of a man who had suspected something for years and was now looking at the proof of it. He closed the case. "This is enough," he said. "This has been enough for 6 years. The question was always whether it would ever reach someone who could act on it." He looked at her. "What does your husband intend to do?" "He intends to appear. He won't run again. They'll hold him the moment they confirm his identity. Colbert has the apparatus in place. The identification will be immediate, the detention will follow within the hour, and the estate transfer paperwork will be executed before any counterfiling can be heard." "Then we need to move faster than the paperwork," she said. Leclerc looked at her with something in his expression that she recognized, that she had seen in Gabriel's face in the gallery, and in the farming man's face when he talked about the drainage, the expression of a person encountering someone who was exactly what the situation required. "I need to make 2 visits," he said. "The first to a colleague at the appellate court, the second to the ministry's oversight office. There is a deputy minister named Fournier who has been waiting for grounds to open an inquiry into Colbert's division for 3 years. This case gives him grounds." He was already reaching for his coat. "Can you keep your husband from being formally processed for 4 hours?" "I don't know," she said honestly. "That is the right answer," he said. People who say yes to that question before they've thought about it are the people who fail. He put on his coat. 4 hours, possibly 3. I'll file the emergency injunction the moment I'm in front of Bertrand. That stops any estate transfer action while the inquiry is opened. After that, Colbert's position becomes very complicated very quickly. He picked up the case. Judge, she said. He stopped. He trusted you because his father trusted you, she said. I need to know that was a sound judgment. The clerk looked at her with the eyes of a man who had spent decades watching power corrupt the people around him and had kept his own hands clean not through indifference, but through the specific, costly effort of someone who understood what clean hands were worth. Your husband's father, he said, was the finest man I knew. I have spent 6 years knowing what Colbert did to him and being unable to prove it. He picked up the case. Today is a different kind of day. He left. She found Mrs. Fontaine on the street outside and told her what she needed, and Mrs. Fontaine looked at her with the expression of a woman reassessing everything she had thought she understood about the woman she had failed. Vidal's office, Mrs. Fontaine said. He keeps the debt documents in a private safe, but he arrives at 9. Before 9, the office is managed by a clerk named Pettit. Does Pettit know who you are? No, he knows only the face of the housekeeper from the Voss property. Evelyn thought about this for 10 seconds. Then you are not the housekeeper from the Voss property this morning. This morning, you are my personal secretary. She looked at Mrs. Fontaine directly. Can you do that? Mrs. Fontaine straightened. Something shifted in her posture. The particular shift of a person who had spent years making themselves small for safety and was now, tentatively, occupying their full height. Yes, she said. They went. Colbert's ministry offices occupied a building in the 4th arrondissement that had been designed, as all such buildings were designed, to make the people who entered them feel the weight of the institution before they'd spoken to anyone. High ceilings, cold marble, the particular acoustic quality of stone that turned footsteps into announcements. Evelyn walked through it without slowing down, without looking up at the ceiling the way visitors were supposed to, without giving the building a single second of the awe it was engineered to extract. She asked a clerk for Maubert. She was told Maubert was not available. She gave the clerk her name, not Madame Voss, not her married name. She gave the clerk Evelyn St. Remy, the daughter of Baron St. Remy, the name she had grown up wearing in rooms like this one, the name that still carried, even in the ruins of her father's finances, the particular resonance of old nobility. The clerk went to find someone more senior. While she waited, she watched the corridor to her left. Maubert had come from Normandy, which meant he had arrived within the last hour, which meant Gabriel was somewhere in this building, being processed in the way people were processed when powerful men wanted them contained quickly and quietly. She thought about him in a room somewhere above her, and she thought about the controlled face and the gray eyes, and the man who had said please in a gallery of his ancestors, and she felt something move through her that was too large and too complicated for the cold marble entrance hall, so she set it aside with the efficiency she'd been applying to everything today that couldn't be immediately useful, and she waited. The man who came was not Maubert. He was younger, officious, wearing the look of a man who had learned to project authority because his actual authority was uncertain. Madame Saint-Remy, he said, I understand you wish to speak with the prefect. I wish to speak with whoever is currently responsible for the detention of my husband, she said, and I wish to do so before any formal processing occurs, which I understand is my right under the Civil Code. She had spent an hour in the carriage reviewing what she remembered of her father's legal library, and what she remembered was enough to sound like certainty even where she was working from the edge of it. Specifically, I wish to address the question of the warrant's authority, which I have grounds to contest. The young man looked at her. He had not been expecting someone who knew about warrant authority. I'll need to consult. Please consult quickly, she said. My legal representative is filing papers at the appellate court as we speak, and once that filing is complete, the question of timing becomes significant for everyone in this building. She watched him process this. She watched the calculation move across his face, the weighing of disruption against the consequences of getting it wrong. And she recognized the calculation because she had seen it in Harwick's face the morning he'd told her about her father's debts, and in Renault's face when she'd said the Duke of Valmere before he could, and in every face she had encountered in the last 6 weeks when she had positioned herself between Gabriel and whatever was coming for him. The young man went away. He came back 12 minutes later and said she could see the prefect, Merjite. Maubert had an office on the 3rd floor that looked out over a courtyard. He was standing at the window when she was shown in, and he turned with the unhurried quality of a man who was already holding what he needed and was merely curious about the interruption. "Madame Voss?" he said. "Saint Remy," she said. She sat without being invited. "Where is my husband?" "Being processed," Maubert said, "as authorized under—" "The warrant," she said, "was signed by Minister Colbert, the same Minister Colbert who is the named beneficiary of the estate transfer that follows from my husband's identification." She looked at Maubert with the flat clarity she had arrived at somewhere around the 2nd hour in the carriage, when the fear had finished burning and left behind something harder. "That is a conflict of interest of a magnitude that makes the warrant legally contestable, and I am contesting it." Maubert looked at her. His face was the face of a man who had not expected this particular obstacle from this particular direction. "You would need legal standing to—" "My legal representative is presenting the documentation at the appellate court this morning. The documentation includes 15 years of evidence regarding Minister Colbert's fraudulent management of the Valmere estate." She held Maubert's gaze and did not blink. "I understand you are doing your job. I am not questioning your good faith. I am telling you that the authority behind this warrant is compromised, and that the men who acted on that authority in good faith will be in a significantly better position if processing is paused until the appellate court ruling is issued." In the silence that followed, she heard, somewhere below them in the building, a door open and close. Maubert looked at her for a long time. He was not a stupid man. She had understood this about him in Normandy, and she understood it more clearly now. He was a man who had worked within a system long enough to understand its vulnerabilities, which meant he also understood when the system was about to shift under him. He was calculating right now where he wanted to be standing when it did. "The processing," he said, "has not been completed." "I'm glad to hear it." "Your husband is in a holding room on the 2nd floor. He looked at her with the particular expression of a man choosing a side. "The clerk who would complete the formal documentation is at lunch." She understood what he was offering. "Of course," she said. "The clerk should take whatever time he needs." She found the 2nd floor by memory of the building's architecture. Old ministry buildings followed predictable logic, the holding rooms toward the inner courtyard, away from the street-facing windows. She walked with the purposeful ease of someone who belonged on this floor and did not require direction. 2 guards stood at the end of a corridor. She walked toward them and said, "The prefect has authorized a brief consultation with my husband." And she said it the way she said everything today. Not loudly, not aggressively, but with the tone of a woman stating a fact that was not in question. One of the guards looked uncertain. The other looked at her face and made a judgment call. He opened the door. Gabriel was sitting at a plain table in a plain room, his hands flat on the table, his posture the controlled posture. He looked up when she came in. For 1 second, less than a second, the controlled face opened completely, and what was in it was not relief or surprise or any of the things she might have expected. What was in it was the expression of a man who had calculated his own odds and had not included this variable, and was now recalculating, and the recalculation was changing everything. "You have a carriage outside," she said quietly, because the guard had left the door slightly open, and she was aware of it. "Mrs. Fontaine is with it. Leclerc has the documents. He's filing now." "How long?" he said. He said 4 hours, possibly 3. Gabriel looked at her. "And you're here." "I'm here." "Evelyn." He said her name the same way he'd said it in the gallery, stripped of formality, just the sound of it, weighted with everything that had no time to be said. "You understand what happens if Colbert moves before Leclerc files?" "I understand." "If the transfer executes before the injunction—" "I understand," she said again. "Gabriel, look at me." He looked at her. "I went to Paris," she said, At 4 in the morning with the documents your mother spent the last 2 years of her life compiling, and I found the man you told me to find, and I told him what you told me to tell him, and I am standing in a ministry holding room having convinced the prefect's clerk to take an extended lunch. I understand the stakes. She held his gaze. Stop explaining them to me. Something happened in his face, not the composed surface and not the thing beneath it, but a third thing she had not seen before. Something that lived past both the armor and the vulnerability, something that was simply him, the actual structure of who he was under everything the world had required him to become. There's something else, he said. His voice dropped further. Colbert is in this building. He arrived 20 minutes before you did. He's not managing this from a distance. He's here because he wants to see it himself. A pause. He does that. He's always done that. My father used to say it was his one weakness, the need to be present when something he built finally paid out. She absorbed this. Where? 4th floor, his personal office. Gabriel's jaw tightened. If he knows Leclerc is moving, and he may, he has people at the court. He won't wait for the transfer paperwork. He'll accelerate the identification, which means taking me to his office directly and bypassing the standard process. Maubert won't be able to hold the clerk at lunch forever. How long do we actually have? Less than 2 hours, he said. Maybe 1. She looked at him. She thought about Leclerc moving through the appellate court with the brown leather case, reading its contents with the focused speed of a man who had spent years waiting for exactly this. She thought about the Deputy Minister Fournier, who had 3 years of waiting behind him. She thought about the machinery of it, all the moving pieces, and she thought about the variable that none of it had accounted for. Colbert doesn't know the documents are gone, she said. Gabriel stilled. What? He thinks they're in the manor. He doesn't know I took them. He doesn't know Leclerc has them. He thinks he's still managing a situation where the only evidence against him is in a locked room in Normandy. She looked at Gabriel. That's his miscalculation. He's been patient for 4 years, but he's not patient today. He's here because he wants to watch. And the thing about wanting to watch is that you position yourself where the watching is. 4th floor. Evelyn, what are you thinking? I'm thinking, she said, that the man who destroyed your family is 1 floor above us and does not yet know that the ground has moved under him. And I'm thinking that there is a conversation that needs to happen before Leclerc files, because once the injunction lands, Colbert becomes untouchable. His lawyers seal everything, the case moves into years of appellate procedure, and your mother's work becomes a legal instrument instead of a reckoning. Gabriel looked at her for a long moment. You want to go to him? I want him to know, she said, before the law takes over, that he lost. That the woman he never accounted for walked out of his careful arrangement with everything he needed to stop her. She held Gabriel's gaze. I want him to see it coming. That's not strategy, he said. I know what it is, she said. It's also the truth. The guard's footsteps shifted in the corridor outside. Gabriel stood. He was taller than the room seemed to want him to be. Something about the plain walls, the plain table, the deliberate diminishment of the space. He stood in it the way he stood in the entrance hall of the manor, the way he sat on the horse, the way he had stood in the gallery in front of his own portrait, like a man who took up exactly as much space as he required and found the question of whether the room approved of it essentially irrelevant. He said, if we do this, we do it together. Yes, she said, and if Leclerc files before we come back down, then Colbert finds out from us first, instead of from a clerk. She moved toward the door. Either way, he finds out. She opened the door. The guard looked at her. She looked at the guard with the expression she had worn in Harwick's office and Mauber's office and the kitchen of her own house, the expression of a woman whose decisions were made. My husband needs to speak with Minister Colbert, she said, on an urgent legal matter before the formal processing continues. She let the words settle. I believe the minister is expecting this conversation. The guard looked at Gabriel. Gabriel looked at the guard with the gray eyes of a man who had spent 8 years being no one, and was, right now, in this plain corridor, deciding to be someone again. 4th floor, Gabriel said. His voice carried the particular quiet authority of a man for whom authority was not a performance, but a language he had spoken since childhood, and the sound of it in this context, in a ministry corridor, in the building where his identity was about to be stripped from him or restored, had a quality that the guard heard without being able to name. The guard stepped aside. They walked toward the staircase together, and behind them the holding room door swung gently on its hinge, and ahead of them the staircase rose through the marble and stone weight of the institution toward the fourth floor, toward the office of the man who had taught a 7-year-old to play chess and spent the next 30 years making sure that boy had nothing left to play with. Evelyn felt the leather case was gone. It was with Leclerc now, moving through the appellate court, doing the work that paper did when paper was given to the right person at the right moment. She had nothing in her hands. She had never, she understood, needed anything in her hands. The case was just the evidence. What she was carrying was something that couldn't be documented. The staircase ended at the fourth floor. A long corridor, dark wood, high windows, the doors of offices closed and authoritative. At the far end, a secretary's desk. A man behind it, looking up. Gabriel walked the corridor the way he had mounted the horse, without drama, without performance, with the complete and unconscious ease of a man coming back to something that had always belonged to him. Each step on the old floor was a small announcement. The secretary stood. "I'm sorry, this floor is—" "Tell Minister Colbert," Gabriel said, and his voice in this corridor had the quality Evelyn had been unable to name since the first day in Harwick's office. The quality she had spent 6 weeks filing and cataloging and trying to locate the source of. It was the voice of a man who had grown up in rooms that required his presence, and no amount of 8 years of deliberate obscurity had entirely erased the grammar of it. That Edouard Montfort is here. The secretary's face changed. He went to the door at the end of the corridor and knocked and went inside. And the door closed behind him, and the corridor was very quiet, and Evelyn stood beside Gabriel and felt the particular quality of the silence between them. Not the silence of strangers sharing a house, not the silence of two people managing an arrangement, but the silence of two people standing at the edge of something irreversible, knowing it was irreversible and having made their peace with that. "Whatever happens in there," Gabriel said, low and direct, "stay behind me." "No," she said. He looked at her. "We've been through this," she said. "We do it together." The door at the end of the corridor opened. The secretary came out and looked at them with an expression she couldn't immediately categorize. Not fear, not confusion, something older and more complicated. The expression of a person witnessing something they had not expected to witness and were not sure how to process. "The minister," the secretary said, "will see you." The door to Colbert's office was open. Through it she could see a desk, windows overlooking the courtyard, a man rising from his chair. He was older than she had imagined. Late 60s, heavy in the way of men who had spent decades in comfortable authority, with the face of someone who had been handsome once and whose remaining looks were organized around the assumption of being listened to. He was looking at Gabriel, and Gabriel was looking at him. And in the quality of that mutual look, across the corridor, across the years, across the full distance of everything that had been done and done again, was something that had nothing to do with law or warrants or estates. It was the look of a reckoning arriving. Evelyn walked through the door first. Colbert's office smelled like cedar and old money and the particular staleness of a room where important decisions had been made for so long that the air itself had absorbed their weight. It was a large room, organized around a desk that was too large for its function and existed instead for its statement. The desk of a man who had spent 30 years ensuring that people sat on the far side of something substantial when they spoke to him. Evelyn did not sit. Neither did Gabriel. Colbert had risen from his chair when they entered, and now he stood behind the desk with the stillness of a man who had been surprised, and had spent the last 3 seconds deciding that he had not been. He was heavier than she had imagined, and older, but his eyes were quick and cold and doing fast work, moving from Gabriel to her and back to Gabriel with the assessment of someone who had spent a lifetime reading rooms and was reading this one with the urgency of a man who understood something had shifted without yet knowing how far. "Edouard," he said. The name landed in the room with the weight of everything it contained. Not Mr. Voss, not the missing Duke. The first name, said by the man who had taught the boy who wore it how to move a knight across a board. Gabriel said nothing. Colbert's eyes moved to Evelyn. "And you are." His wife, she said. Evelyn St. Remy. Something shifted in Colbert's face, a micro-adjustment, the recalibration of a man encountering a variable he had not included. He had known about the marriage. She could see that he had known about it, that Maubert would have reported it. What he had not included was the variable of her standing here, in this office, having arrived before his process completed. The wife was supposed to be in Normandy. The wife was supposed to be irrelevant. He looked at Gabriel again. "You should have stayed dead," he said. Not as a threat, as a statement of practical fact, the tone of a man reviewing a strategic error. "You were safe. You had a life, whatever this woman told you about documents and judges." "She didn't tell me," Gabriel said. "She went. There's a difference." The silence between the two men was not the silence of people who had nothing to say. It was the silence of people who had 30 years of things to say and were choosing, each of them, which weight to pick up first. Colbert moved around the desk, not toward them. He stopped at the side of it, which was a different kind of movement, the move of a man adjusting his position rather than advancing. And Evelyn tracked it the way she had learned to track everything in rooms where power was being negotiated. "You have nothing," Colbert said. "Whatever your mother compiled, wherever it's been sitting for 8 years, it is inadmissible. It is the private documentation of a grieving woman who—" "It is in the hands of Judge Leclerc," Evelyn said, "at the appellate court, filed as of this morning." The room changed. It was not dramatic, the change. Colbert did not flinch, did not make any of the large gestures that people made in stories when they understood the game was over. He was too controlled for that, too long practiced in the management of his own exposure. But something behind his eyes went very still, and in that stillness was the first true silence of a man who had run every calculation available to him and arrived at a number he hadn't expected. He looked at Gabriel. "Leclerc," he said. "My father's friend," Gabriel said. "The one man you never found a use for." A pause. He found a use for himself. Colbert set his hands flat on the surface of the desk. She watched his hands, not trembling, nothing as human as that, but the pressure of them against the wood was a tell, the body's honest account of what the face was not permitted to show. "You understand what happens now," Colbert said. "Even with Leclerc, even with whatever your mother thought she documented, this becomes years of legal procedure. You have no money. You have no title until the appellate process resolves. You have a wife who married a dead man and a house that—" "Armand," Gabriel said the name quietly. The first name, the same way Colbert had used his, not as an attack, not as a weapon, but as a key turning in a lock. A reminder that they had been, once, people to each other. That the chess lessons had been real. That the Christmas tables had been real. That whatever Colbert was, and whatever he had done, there had been a version of their shared history that was not entirely constructed. Colbert stopped talking. "I spent 8 years," Gabriel said, "trying to understand what you are. Whether you started out this way or became it. Whether there was a moment where you chose it, or whether it was accumulation, small decisions that looked reasonable one at a time." He looked at the older man without anger, without the heat she might have expected from a man who had spent 8 years as a consequence of what stood across from him. What was in his face instead was colder and quieter than anger. "I stopped trying to understand. It doesn't matter. You did what you did to my father, and my mother spent herself proving it, and I spent 8 years being no one so that proof could survive long enough to be used. And now it has been used." He paused. "That's all this is. That's all it ever was." Colbert looked at him for a long moment. The quick, cold eyes were doing something she couldn't entirely read. A reassessment, something deeper than the tactical recalibration of the last few minutes. The reassessment of a man looking at someone he had underestimated for 30 years and understanding, too late, the nature and scale of the error. "You're not here for justice," Colbert said. "Leclerc can deliver justice. You came up here for something else." "Yes," Gabriel said. "For what?" Gabriel was quiet for a moment. Outside the windows, the courtyard was doing its ordinary business. Clerks crossing the stone. A cart delivering something. The ambient noise of an institution that would continue its work regardless of what happened in this room. He looked at Colbert with the gray eyes that had kept their own counsel since before she'd known him, and he said, I wanted you to know I was alive. I wanted you to hear it from me, not from a document or a warrant. I wanted you to stand in a room with me and understand that everything you built on top of what you took, the position, the arrangement, the 30 years of being untouchable, it ends today. And you'll know, for however long you have after today, that the boy you taught chess is the reason it ended. Colbert said nothing. The silence held for a moment that was longer than its clock duration, the kind of moment that accumulated weight as it passed. Then Evelyn said, "We're leaving now." She said it to both of them, but she said it the way she had said everything today, as a statement of what was happening, not a request for agreement. She put her hand through Gabriel's arm, not the careful arm touch of a formal arrangement, but the deliberate anchor of a woman who was taking someone with her, and she turned toward the door. At the threshold, she stopped. She looked back at Colbert, still standing at the side of his desk with his hands flat on the wood. "Your son's debt documents," she said. "The ones Vidal holds for my housekeeper's son. They'll be included in the materials Leclerc is filing as evidence of your coercive practices." She looked at him with the flat clarity she had arrived at 4 a.m. and had not lost since. "If I were you, I would not waste time on the estate today. I would spend it thinking about which of your colleagues can be trusted with your situation." A beat. "You taught my husband that the king is the most important piece. You were right, but you forgot what happens to the board when the king falls." She walked out. Walked. Gabriel said nothing until they were in the stairwell. Then he stopped on the second landing and put his back to the wall and closed his eyes for 3 seconds. And she stood and watched him do it. Watched the controlled surface drop completely, just for those 3 seconds, the way it had dropped in the gallery when she'd been standing in front of his portrait, the brief total surrender of a man who had been holding everything for a very long time. Then he opened his eyes. "She got the documents from Vidal's," he said. "I sent her while I was finding Leclerc. She told the clerk she was there to retrieve materials related to the Voss estate on behalf of the current legal representative." Evelyn met his gaze. Clerks in ministry offices are trained to facilitate retrieval. They're not trained to question well-dressed women who sound like they know exactly what they want. Something moved across his face. The third thing again, not the armor, not the exposed vulnerability beneath it, but the actual structure of him, the thing that had survived 8 years of being no one, and had come back here and stood in a room with the man who had destroyed his family and said what needed to be said without becoming the kind of man who destroyed families. "You knew," he said, "from the beginning, in Harwick's office. You knew something was wrong." "Yes. And you came anyway." "The terms were fair," she said. "Shelter and stability. I needed both." She paused. "I didn't know I was also getting someone worth keeping." The stairwell was cold and plain and smelled of stone and lamp oil, and it was not the kind of place where things of weight were usually said. She had spent the last several hours moving through rooms designed to diminish the people who entered them, and she was tired in the way of someone who had been operating at the edge of their capacity and could feel the edge. Gabriel looked at her. He looked at her the way he had looked at the road from the manor window, the way he had looked at the portrait in the gallery, the way he had listened to her in Harwick's office with the attention of a man cataloging something he intended to use, but the quality of it now was different. It was not the assessment of a cautious man managing a situation. It was the look of someone who had stopped managing and started simply seeing. "I have nothing to offer you," he said. "Not today. The title is contested, the estate is tied in process, the house is—" "Gabriel." He stopped. "I didn't marry the title," she said, "or the estate." She held his gaze. "I married the man who brought me a book about plants because he remembered something I said about my mother. That is the person I am choosing. The rest is paperwork." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I am not easy to live with." "No," she agreed. "You're guarded and you don't explain yourself and you maintain secrets by instinct, even when they've stopped being necessary." She held his gaze without softening it. "I am impatient and direct, and I will walk into a ministry office at 7 in the morning and rearrange your entire situation without asking permission." A pause. "We're both difficult. That's a foundation." Something happened in his face that was not quite a smile. Too quiet for that, too complicated, but carried in it the same quality as the exhale she had heard when they'd first arrived at the manor. The sound of something being set down after a long carry. He reached out and tucked a strand of hair back from her face, with the same deliberate care he brought to everything. The good coat badly materialed, the well-maintained boots, the precise attention of a man who had been taught that how you did small things was the measure of who you were. "All right," he said, the same word she had used in Harwick's office, in the sitting room doorway, in the kitchen. He said them now with the same quality she had put into them each time, the choice made in full clarity, without the delusion of understanding everything it entailed, without the false comfort of a guarantee. They went downstairs. Leclerc found them in the entrance hall 30 minutes later. He came through the main doors with the case under his arm, and a man Evelyn did not recognize beside him, younger, sharper-eyed, the particular alert energy of someone who had just been handed something significant and was still feeling the weight of it. "Deputy Minister Fournier," Leclerc said by way of introduction. He looked at Gabriel with an expression that was many things at once. The look of a man seeing the son of his closest friend after 8 years. The look of a man who had spent those years feeling the absence of what he was now looking at. "The injunction is filed. The estate transfer is frozen pending inquiry." He paused. "Colbert's office is being sealed as we speak." Gabriel held out his hand. Leclerc took it. They held the grip for a moment longer than a formal handshake required, and in the length of it was something that had no language, the particular weight of men who had both loved the same person and had been, each in their own way, inadequate to save him. "Your mother," Leclerc said quietly, "would have found today satisfying." Gabriel's jaw tightened. He nodded once. Fournier stepped forward with the brisk efficiency of a man who operated in the practical rather than the emotional. "The formal restoration of title will take time. The legal process is—" "I understand the process," Gabriel said. "Yes." Fournier looked at him with the assessing eyes of a man recalibrating. "I imagine you do." He paused. "For what it's worth, Duke of Valmere, your mother's documentation is the most thorough evidence of ministerial fraud I have encountered in 20 years. The process will move. I will see to it personally." He left with the efficient momentum of a man who had a great deal of work ahead of him and was not displeased about it. Leclerc looked at Evelyn. "Your husband said to find the one man he trusted in Paris." He paused. "You found him before 8 in the morning with enough documentation to end a 30-year arrangement. I want to say that was good fortune, but I don't think it was." "It wasn't," she agreed. He looked at them both. At Gabriel, who was standing the way he had stood in every room she had seen him in, taking up exactly as much space as he required, and at Evelyn, who was standing beside him the way the elm trees stood in wind. He made a small sound that was not quite a laugh, but contained the relief of one. "Go home," he said. "Both of you. I'll be in touch when there's something to act on." They drove back in the afternoon. Mrs. Fontaine held the reins with the same competence she brought to everything, and the debt documents she had retrieved from Vidal's clerk were folded inside her coat against her chest, and she sat with the straightened posture of a woman who had spent a day doing something that would cost her something and had decided the cost was right. Evelyn sat in the carriage this time. Gabriel sat across from her. For a while neither of them spoke, and it was not the silence of the first carriage ride, not the managed distance of two strangers respecting each other's unfamiliarity. It was the silence of two people who had been through something together and were letting it settle, the way you let your eyes adjust to ordinary light after a long time in darkness. The Normandy fields came back gradually, the flat gray giving way to something more textured, the particular quality of October land that had been worked and would be worked again, the patient endurance of country that didn't require anything of you beyond your presence. "When I was 14, Gabriel said, my father took me to the Valmere estates for the first time as the heir, formally. A ceremony, a presentation to the tenants. I was terrified. Not of the ceremony, of the weight of it. The idea that all those lives were connected to a name I hadn't done anything to earn yet. He was looking out the window at the passing fields. He told me that the title was not the inheritance. The land was not the inheritance. He said the inheritance was the responsibility, and that responsibility was not a burden, but a direction. That it pointed you somewhere. That it told you what your life was for. She listened. I spent 8 years deciding he was wrong, Gabriel said, that the responsibility had been used to trap him, that the inheritance was a mechanism for other people to own you. He turned from the window. I was not wrong about Colbert, but I was wrong about my father. He paused. He knew what Colbert was. He chose the responsibility anyway. Not because he was naive, because abandoning the responsibility would have meant becoming someone else, someone lighter and freer and fundamentally not himself. A breath. I understand that now. I didn't when I staged my death. I thought I was protecting myself. I was partly protecting myself and partly destroying the one thing that told me what my life was for. She looked at him, at the face that had spent 8 years learning to be no one and was now, in the ordinary afternoon light of a Normandy carriage, learning to be someone again. The land needs work, she said. He looked at her. The East Fields, the drainage in the lower quarter, the tenant cottages on the north side. 2 of them need roofing before February. She held his gaze. The manor needs proper staffing, and the gardens need to be returned to something their designer would recognize. There is enough to occupy several lifetimes. A pause. I would like to open a school for the local girls. There is a building in the village that could serve if someone negotiated the lease. Gabriel was quiet for a moment. That would require remaining, he said. Yes, she said. It would require remaining, both of us. She looked at him without softening anything. Not because you